It's Wizards versus Lesbians, a podcast for your ears. Hello and welcome to Wizards versus Lesbians. My name is Isaac.
I'm Alexis.
I'm Leora.
Yes, which means that this is a bonus episode because we are talking about a book that does not feature lesbians.
No, but boy does it feature gender.
It sure does. The book in question is Translation State by Ann Leckie. The usual Ann Leckie disclaimer that Alexis knows Ann Leckie. I don't, and so I will feel free to say whatever I'm going to say.
Ann Leckie liked Alexis's dissertation.
Thank you for bragging on my behalf.
I feel this needs to be on the record.
Thank you for bragging on my behalf so that I don't have to.
Leora, you will be surprised to know that this came up in the Q&A episode. So that's 2 episodes we're recording in a row. But regardless, who wants to do the plot?
Leora, why don't you try to do the plot?
All right. Translation State brings us back to the universe of the Imperial Raj, but not actually the Rajai themselves. It opens where we meet Anaye. You did audiobook, right?
Yeah, the audiobook narrator thinks it's Enna.
Okay. We meet Enna, who is a middle-aged human who has been tending to a abusive grandmother for quite some time and is now...
I think it doesn't, and I use see, hear, hears.
I think you're right. Sorry. There are characters in this book who use A.
There's a lot of
neo-pronouns. You're right. I think Anna's pronouns are see, hear, hears. My apologies. Anyway, so in one part of the book, Anna is going on a quest to figure a thing out that's a spoiler. And separately, we have 2 other characters who are also trying to figure out where they fit in the universe. We have Gwen, who is a juvenile Presker translator, a sort of human-alien hybrid-y thing that involves a lot of cannibalism and other violence. And Reet, who is a hanging out, kind of disaffected, also 30-something guy on a space station looking for a place to belong. And he's always felt a bit weird. Probably because he regularly has fantasies about cannibalism and eviscerating people. And these 3 people will come together to do a bunch of stuff that has some political ramifications for the galaxy as part of the broader conclave that we've heard about in the end of the trilogy and going on in the background of Providence.
Yeah, I think that'll do. So yeah, no, we're having sort of made her way onto the scene with Ancillary Justice. It's sort of been DS9 episodes since, I would say.
Yeah, kind of.
In a way that reminds me of CJ Cherry.
Yes, well...
Which is definitely a good thing.
I think CJ Cherry is a pretty major influence on Ann Leckie's work, so...
Yes. So there are not lesbians in this book, as we have established, because there are a lot of other genders flying around, but very few women per se.
Except for from the perspective of the Ratch, where everybody
is, so it's a meaningless distinction.
I guess technically we could do the Ancillary trilogy because everybody's female, so like Save Arden is totally a lesbian.
Well, I would argue that I came to a realization while reading this book, which is that the reason that we've been struggling to fit Ann Leckie books into the Wizards versus Lesbians canon, even though they sort of came out of the same bloom.
Well, I mean, they sort of kicked off that bloom.
Exactly. The reason they don't fit is that they are not actually Wizards versus Lesbian books. They are, in fact, examples of the other microgenre that we're starting to notice, which is narcissistic parents of monstrous children.
Yeah, this is certainly narcissistic parents of monstrous children, like the book.
Yeah, and I think if you go back and look at, I think that it works for translation state. Obviously, it works for it works for.
It totally works for Providence.
It totally works for Providence, and I think that it works for the ancillary books as well to a greater or lesser extent.
I mean, yeah, sure. You can consider Anandra Mianai to be Brecht's parent,
terrible parent.
Absolutely.
Which makes sense because I mean, the Wizards versus Lesbians microgenre is at its heart terrible parents of non-conforming children.
Don't forget the glove kink.
Oh yes, it's also, as a Tumblr friend of mine likes to refer to this broader genre as glove kink cinematic universe.
Yes, of course.
So, and this definitely is one of the foundational texts for the glove kink cinematic universe. But yes, so there's absolutely wizards.
Instead of the usual questions, then I want to ask, are there narcissistic parents in this book?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Are there monstrous children?
Oh, absolutely.
Definitely.
Yep, so we're
do they fight?
right in there. Oh, yes, they do.
They do that.
Yes, they do.
I would like to say that this book does include an example of, like, genuinely good parenting that is unusual.
Yes, no, this book is very much interested in presenting the counterfactual. There are good parents in this book, and there are good parents that are a little bit annoying and not perfect, which I really appreciate.
Yes, that's. I think we're gonna get a lot of mileage out of talking about models of parenting here. So, okay, why should you read this book?
It's full of fun and interesting ideas, which I think will be fun to talk about.
Yes, and it picks up some interesting threads from the previous Imperial Ratch books. I think if you liked the other Imperial Ratch books, you should read this. You may or may not like it, but it engages with them in an interesting way.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think that there's a lot of interesting ideas, and again, I mean, I'll say DS9 again here, but if you are interested in that, it's sort of a nostalgic kind of like politics work, through committees and negotiations, and like actual politics that actually works, which is sort of very nostalgic at this point in history.
Yes.
Then yeah, there's a lot to enjoy about that.
Yeah.
And the politics are smart.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's worth also saying explicitly if you like your books where there's a lot of different politics going on and people are on different sides of coalitions for all kinds of complicated personal reasons. This book's got that.
Yeah, and it's a book that it is a book that is willing to let its politics be complicated and its marginalized people be awful and stupid, while still having a sort of fundamental commitment to the idea that human rights are nonetheless valuable even when people are being really stupid. That I really appreciate. Yes,
I would say that that's correct. Although I do have a few quibbles with that very last part, the execution, not the sort of the intention behind it. As to why you shouldn't read it, I had a lot of trouble with the pacing. I think that the ending really loses the thread, not in terms of its content, but in terms of just the pace at which things happen. I think the book is struggling with you need peril at the end of your book, when maybe you didn't in this case. It's trying to do a couple of different things at once, and it doesn't quite work. So the back third is kind of a struggle, or was for me, but you get most of the cool ideas before that point.
I'm not sure to call the back third, but the part where suddenly lives are in danger and we have to solve this crisis immediately or we'll all die. definitely did feel a little bit out of sync
Feels
with the rest.
obligatory, I'll put it that way.
It does, yes. It feels obligatory.
And certainly out of tone with a lot of the rest of the book.
Right, with a lot of the rest of the book, which is about, the importance of politics and legal process and the ways that those can, save or ruin your life.
Yes, I agree completely. But that's really my only complaint, and all of the stuff that's really fun and interesting and engaging is present before you really start to feel that. So
I would say if you did not enjoy the Imperial Batch trilogy, or you have not read it,
that's
probably
true.
Don't read this. Some, like Provenance, I felt like, there's some stuff going on in the universe that you'll understand better if you've read the other 3 first, but I feel like it stood alone more than that. I feel like there was a lot going on in this one that you really benefit from having the background from the original trilogy for. And also, if you're not into books where the point of view changes a lot because you wanted to get back to the one character you were most invested in, this book may annoy you.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it is, to bring Cherry up again, it is kind of like dipping into Foreigner, 5 or 6 books in.
Yes.
And trying to catch up with what's going on. Being like, and, a lot of the pleasure of it is like, oh, I remember that character from that place, and I remember this character from this other book.
Right,
And, even though you don't strictly have to have read those books, it certainly enhances your experience having read them.
Yes, absolutely. So content warnings. There's
Sexual assault, cannibalism, mutilation, body horror, the mind melding thing that keeps coming up in these books.
emotional abuse.
There's
Bad
a fair
parents.
amount of background genocide and torture of
A fair
political
amount of background
dissidents.
genocide.
Yes.
Yes, no, growing up in the Japanese educational system in the 1930s, but more so, and so on and so on. That being said, shall we head on in?
Yeah.
Spoiler zone.
Spoiler zone. Spoiler zone. Alrighty. So yeah, no. So I'm just gonna say that I'm not going to call him Kven. I'm going to call him Kevin. Because he's literally a neurodivergent minor. And
They/A,
They're
depending.
they at
Sorry.
the beginning of the book, and then they become
AM air.
It's actually very
Or
deliberate.
EM-air? I don't know.
Is that Kven's
a neurodivergent minor with pronouns.
Kevin's, sections are deliberately written in the first person, in part because they're still figuring out who A wants to be, and at the
Yes.
end they decide.
I do apologize.
A.
Well, it's interesting. Fenn picks AM/air as as pronouns, but air pronouns. But then when there's the mind merge, they decide that they is probably best now that they're two people smushed
True,
together. And then,
but by that point, they're not Kevin anymore. They're another person who hasn't picked out a name yet. So, if you haven't noticed, there's a lot of transgender stuff.
There's so much
So
trans
much.
stuff.
There's a lot of stuff going on. I also really appreciated in classic trans culture that part of how Kven picks air pronouns is based on the character that A felt most connected to
Yes.
in their new fandom.
I'm a princess in disguise. I want to give a shout out to the narrator of this audiobook for keeping track of all of the neopronouns and not once tripping over any of it. That's very impressive. But the violent choice of making Kven extremely Welsh was as it changed the way that I read the book to an extent that you don't want an audiobook to usually, I think. But yes, no, Kevin E is a neurodivergent minor who has done some bad things, but has also been abused, and is incredibly Welsh, and and that's all that, and I'm never going to be able to get away from that. But also, and I actually wanted to bring this up because I think this book is in dialogue with the Murderbot books, because being super into the drama series and having that be part of the way that you interact with the world as an autistic coded individual is something they now both have in common. And being bred for a particular purpose as a sort of autistic entity is something they have in common. And also, arguably with the ancillaries, Leckie got there first. And so it's an interesting give and take of thematic components.
Yeah, it's true, especially because because the dramas also show up in
the trilogy.
Yeah, there's there's the whole thing with there's the thing where Breck is hanging out watching dramas, and of course we also see even more so musical dramas show up in the Machineries of Empire, because Cheris is really into them.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
So I think and this stuff predates Murderbot. I think that part of this is that these works being in dialogue with each other, but I also think that part of this is the generation of space opera that comes out once everybody's been online, has had online fandom for a generation.
Yeah. It's like how do you write an autistic character who doesn't have blorbos?
Right, exactly. And even if it's not, blorbos, it's still just being really into media watching is something that I think is different now, because now pretty much anything you want to watch, you can probably pirate somewhere. And that's basically been true since you and I were in college. I mean, this is the generation of space opera where you could get where you could stream stuff or, torrent fan-subbed anime and K-dramas and things like that. And, as opposed to hoping that the guy who had a crush on your high school best friend would turn over a few more Sailor Moon fan-sub VHSs.
We still remember the bad old days, if only vaguely. I'm sure that these works are sort of all in dialogue with each other, but it's also just that they're coming out of a specific generational thing of, oh my god, I can finally watch media without paying for cable. Yes.
Or having friends.
We had friends. Lyra, what were you saying?
Oh, just that I've read fanfic where Murderbot and Breck meet.
Oh,
and
yes.
this exists. It's clearly a connection and bonding over that kind of thing. I totally think that you have a compelling parallel there.
And actually, come to think of it, there's also, speaking of these things being in dialogue, Foreigner, and Cherry really is the foremother of this entire the new space opera.
Yes, this is absolutely true.
Foreigner has also now developed fan-subbed Atevi dramas and stuff like that. But I think it's also, again, just seeing this in the culture.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. This is just reflecting the world as we see it around us, as is in the fine tradition of space opera.
Yes.
What is your favorite space opera story? Mine is probably Ginga Eiyu Densetsu, also known as Legend of the Galactic Heroes, or Heldensagen vom Kosmos Incel. And if you think that's long, you should try watching it. And actually, this brings up another work that this might be in dialogue with, which is Steven Universe, on account of the whole weird, overdetermined, and not quite accurate, not quite like one thing or the other sex metaphor that is merging.
Yes.
And which in Steven Universe is a reversible process, not so much in this one, which makes the stakes rather higher. But it's still used both as sort of a like cultural difference metaphor and as a sex metaphor, and as an adolescence metaphor. And
yeah, I mean, I thought puberty sucked as a human, but wow, Presker translator puberty is real rough.
Indeed.
It does help, and this is again where these books really are much better if you've read the Imperial Ratch books. It does help explain a lot of Dleek and Zayats, who are clearly actually the same person, weird things about their identity.
Yes, agreed. So let's talk about the Presker translators and their identity. So I've said autism coded like 17 times already.
Yes.
I will say it again. So when we were discussing, it was Valhalla that we were discussing, where I was like, yeah, I can relate to being like this sort of weird, violent kid. This may seem like a reference to an episode that we have not released yet, but that's only if your conception of time is kind of boring and linear, with strange urges. And you're like, you should read Translation State. And I did. And I was like, oh, all right. Okay.
Right.
I see what you're saying.
Yes.
So, and it seems like, to me, I think the most interesting thing about the Presker translator juveniles and the adult translators is that they are, they seem to be in dialogue between like what humans consider sort of rationality, and sort of our version of adulthood, and a force which is almost entirely, incomprehensible to humans, but is sort of pre-verbal, animalistic, instinctual. Is sort of the idea is that like the Presker make these holes in space sort of as a biological process. They're not really sort of a scientific species. They're just sort of a force.
Well, we still don't actually know much about the Presker. I mean, we do know that they make holes in space as a biological process, but we still don't actually know much about what it's like to be Presker.
Well, the thing that we can infer based on the fact that the Presker translators are humans redesigned to make sense to Presker, is a lack of real concern about individual, life, but also a overwhelming desire to take things apart and to look at how they work.
Yes, and that we knew already from the ancillary books.
Exactly.
Because, that's basically the things that we know about the Presker are that they have incredibly fancy technology, and that their translators are extremely weird, that they can't really distinguish between members of a same species. So, like, they're not even really, they can't understand the concept of nation states. And they, and that they have this weird time and space stuff. Yeah. Oh, and that they like to pull apart human ships. That was the other thing.
Right. So the net effect of sort of the human Presker hybrid is that these are entities that have been designed to merge bodies with each other when they become old, for reasons that are still not entirely clear, and that they love to kill and eat one another, just sort of as a joyful thing, and that means that they sort of lack a kind of instinctual horror of death, and also that they lack sort of an instinctual empathy, and you could argue about child psychology right now about whether that's learned or not, but there is a bit of there's echoes of the autistic equals psychopath sort of rumbling going on here under the surface.
Yeah, and then part of the point of Kven's narrative is complicating that.
And of Wheat's narrative, because
That's true. Because
part
Wheat
of what's
has
going on is
learned
that
empathy.
right, Wheat is a Presco juvenile who has grown up being assumed to be human, and at the stage of life where Kven is like hanging out with a bunch of other Presco juveniles, taking each other apart and eating them, Wheat is like in human first grade and gets sent home for biting a classmate, and his parents are like, this is not okay. You are causing this other person pain. And like one of his parents explicitly says at some point that once it got through to him that what he was doing was actually causing harm, he stopped doing it. It just wasn't intuitive to him that it was. And so we see that, like, you know, the way that Kven's childhood was is not inevitable.
Yeah, and it's like when I got in trouble for biting a kid when I was young, I was, you know, it was cultural pressure that made me not do it again, because I was made fun of it for the rest of my elementary school career. I
largely only bit in self-defense.
Well, I mean, he was hugging me. I didn't like it.
That's self-defense.
But the point is that, but the point is that, yeah, no, there's this, there is a, you know, nature versus nurture thing, because the narcissistic parents, in this case, the adult Presker translators, are sure that the autistic children are inherently violent and like a danger to everything around them. And, but they're also brought up in an environment which encourages them to, which not only fails to punish them for harming each other, but actively encourages them to do so. And Reed is brought up in a normal human, you know, environment with good parents, and manages to refrain from murdering other people.
With two good parents and one less good parent who, you know, nonetheless loves him, and everybody kind of makes excuses for him, but is at least, you know, kind of trying.
That's fine. You don't need perfect parents to become a good person. You just need parents who are trying. You know?
Yes.
And he does try.
Yeah, but, you know, it's interesting because this is partly about what kinds of behavioral conditioning do and don't work. And you get to see that this sort of, you know, what the Presker translators are putting their juveniles through is kind of ABA-like. It's very much, we're going to force you to, you know, rote mimic these behaviors with punishment if you don't.
Sit on this chair. Do not fidget.
Mask.
Here is your social script for how to, like, have a tea party.
ABA stands for Applied Behavior Analysis. It's a process which tries to make autistic children into normal kids through a series of rewards and punishments. These punishments no longer include electroshock, for the most part. Proponents of ABA include Autism Speaks, which is an organization run by narcissistic parents of autistic children, and the National Institute of Health. Opponents of ABA include ASAN, which is an organization run by autistic people, and the Wizards vs. Lesbians podcast.
And, like, then it shows up later from the perspective of one of the other characters who's like, wow, Kven is really weird. And then there's, like, the mention of tea, and Kven has the script and, like, all of a sudden is behaving like a very excellent Rajshai aristocrat, because that is the behavior they have learned to parrot.
Yes, it reminded me of the way that the world's worst graduate advisor in The Outside described her upbringing.
Yes. Well, again, because I really think that this is based on, like, actual ABA methods for
Yes.
torturing autistic children.
Yes,
Sorry,
it's
that
like-
was a little bit of editorializing, but
But no, but I think
Accurately
the wizards versus lesbians can come out against that particular kind of pedagogical methodology.
You heard it here, everyone. The stance of wizard versus lesbians.
we are anti-Martin Luther and
anti-ABA, and
a variety of other things.
yeah.
Yes.
But so actually, though, because we were talking about the sort of atrocities committed by Kven, and one thing that I thought the book, it was just a really good little moment, which works both as a commentary on what makes these people monstrous, and also on the genre itself, because a thing that we've noticed is that there's in a lot of these books, there tends to be a real sort of moral double standard of, is this happening to somebody on screen or off? And to a named person versus an unnamed person. And so you have the great moment where they're, like, no, you can't just leave Kven uncontrolled. They've, they killed countless people. And Kven's like counting to himself and it's like 30 something. And Sphene, the war criminal, battleship goes, oh, I've killed way more than that.
I've killed more than that in a single day. 34? That's nothing.
I really liked it as both being funny, but also as a commentary on how we treat, and this genre particularly treats, off-screen genocide versus on-screen murder.
Yeah, there are a few really good biting jokes in this book, which I appreciated, and that's certainly one of them. The other one is the bit where the shock troops find Kven dismembering and serial killer posing the terrorist that he killed, because that's what he thinks he's supposed to do to people he's killed. And
well, also because he's really
gently
mad at them because they tried to kill Em and Reet.
No, I don't think so. I don't think that that's even implied. I think that's just what he's supposed to do.
Yeah, what you do.
What you do when you kill somebody is then you take them apart.
Right.
And the human shock troops are like...
The hardened soldiers are like, oh.
Yes, are like, oh, you're not and thus everybody who's been arguing,
we're going to
that
take you to
these
the padded
people,
room now,
right? And then everybody's been arguing that Kven and Reet can integrate into human society. The ones who know Kven and Reet are still like, no, the children who are in their 30s, the children should obviously still be human, and yet the other humans are like, fine, they can be human somewhere else.
Yeah. This sort of brings to me sort of the tone of these of the Rajshai books. Is there a term for the overarching whole series here, or?
I don't know. I call it, I think of it as the Imperial Ratch universe, in that it is the universe that contains the Imperial Ratch.
Yeah.
And where the Imperial Ratch are a major political and cultural force, even when they're not the. Mm-hmm.
I was noticing. I mean, this book has despite all of the killing and eating, this book has a much lighter tone than Ancillary Justice, and yes. I think that's sort of been a general trend since. And I do miss a little bit of the sort of the cynicism of Ancillary Justice sometimes, but I do appreciate that the way that it emerges is in these very funny dark moments. That are sort of peppered throughout. I mean,
the thing is, this is kind of in tone, with the exception of the weird action scene near the end. In tone, this is kind of like an old-fashioned comedy of manners. I mean, it even starts with the spinster, who's dependent on the charity of extended relatives.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of tea parties in this book.
There's so many tea parties in this book.
And a lot of what happens is based on the correct performance of social scripts.
Yeah.
Indeed. Which is, again, very, very foreigner, very cherry.
Yes.
And it's interesting in how it goes, because part of Breck as a character in the trilogy is that Breck exists outside these basic social norms, knows them, can play along with them as necessary.
But since she doesn't see herself as human, she sort of fundamentally opts out of this stuff.
Right. So,
right. And Kven is sort of doing forming a similar role, but like the comedic version of that.
Yes.
In this book.
Yeah.
The sort of the more farcical version.
Yes.
Yeah, and part of that is that, Breck is a, like 10,000-year-old spaceship. How old is Breck?
Yeah, thousands and thousands of years.
Thousands of years old. With, like, at the beginning of Ancillary Justice, a very clear idea of where she fits into the universe and what her goals are. And, somewhat in Provenance, and really in this book, our 3 point-of-view characters all have no idea where they fit into the broader universe and don't know where they're going and what they're doing. And a lot of their narrative is trying to figure out how they can make choices that matter.
Yes, I agree.
It's also Breck. First, Breck doesn't have to follow, social norms because she's a giant warship. And also not human. And then in the second 2 books, she gets away with flouting social norms because she's been adopted by a non-Hermione to her eternal annoyance. And so she keeps just being like, oh, well, I can get away with this because I'm not human and I don't take your stuff seriously. And everybody, instead of going... And everyone goes, well, yes, you can get away with it because you're from the highest status family in, the galaxy. It's a funny moment in the original trilogy where she keeps trying to flout convention and actually can't because she's been made too high status.
Indeed. So I want to talk about the melding.
Yes.
Because this is something that has come up a lot in various books that we've done, particularly sort of our core Wizards versus Lesbians books.
Yes.
The Ninth Houses and the Machineries and the various other empires and so forth.
Yeah, the Memory Called. The
Texcalon books is, becoming 2 people in one brain, which I always go back to Pern and being and mind melding with your dragon back in the Anne McCaffrey books. But has been definitely sort of a subject of fascination and horror, sometimes more horror, sometimes more fascination for SF writers for years. I felt the urge to merge. It's a common theme among people like me. But later I found out that there is no difference between mine and your personality. In that they're both illusions. And I have 2 questions about this one. Is that I think is it sort of presented as like as a sort of a fantasy for autistic people for like, being able to cross that sort of interpersonal isolation barrier? And also, is this book engaging in ace discourse? Because like I was thinking, is Kven supposed to be an ace, character? It's like all of the teenagers in his culture are supposed to want to get, meldy with other people when they hit puberty. But he or
Kven is not a he.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I've made the mistake of calling him Kevin in my brain, and that screwed me over. But he is repulsed by the idea, and so initially I thought, is this supposed to be an ace character in this culture? But then he decides, no, he actually wants to, now that he's been exposed to it in a non-rapey scenario with somebody who he actually likes.
Well, one could say that's a spec, and he's just quite demi, if that's the metaphor. But I'm not convinced that's the metaphor.
I mean, I think so. Well, here's the thing: the author's dead, right? The metaphor
Yes.
is whatever you want it to be, and I think that's a valid reading. I think
Sure.
is mildly repulsed by sex until meeting the one person or one of the rare people that is appealing is, there's a valid demisexual reading there.
Okay. You might be wondering if the author is dead. How can one reading be more valid than any other? If there's no right answer, then what makes one argument more valid than another? And take it from me as a graduate in postmodern historiography from a university that treated history as if it were just another kind of narrative. All that matters is whether you can support your argument or not. And who gets to decide if your argument is supported or not? It's me. That seems reasonable.
But I also think that, Kven's underlying problem with it is less about Kven isn't repulsed by the idea of having sex melding. It's the vulnerability. It's specifically, A doesn't like it because everyone else around M sees the melding pair as food.
Yes, there is that.
It's specifically objectification / becoming a consumable object.
Right. It's the being desired and being sort of opened up to. It's not just the mortifying ordeal of being known, but also like that buying into sex, particularly in a culture where buying into sex makes you a sort of a target, as it is for cis women in our culture a lot of the time. It opens them up to that feeling of terror and vulnerability,
along with their PTSD from having one of they were already repulsed,
and
that's how
that's what is used. Their fear of sex is actually preyed upon.
Right, they're offered an escape, which turns out to be an excuse to get them alone for this character to Sam, I think.
Yes, Sam, as opposed to Kevin, but yes.
Sam tries to forcibly meld in a way that's deeply traumatic to Kven and does not make them more enthusiastic about the idea of melding. But also part of what's going on for them there is that they're very aware that the plan for M is to meld with an already existing established entity, and it's their perception, and I think they're probably right from what we get, that when two juveniles match, they become a new interesting combo
individual
entity, right? This is sort of more like I guess more like Paul in then, right? It's a question of whether you're becoming Paul in Nona or whether you're becoming a lictor. And the metaphor is not exact,
right.
But that's what Kven is afraid of, is that they're just going to get eaten to continue to power the existing entity, and their body will just be one of the extra bodies of this existing entity and not...
Which is also a plot point in A Memory Called Empire.
Yeah. But, as we've established, this is a comedy of manners, so it's the difference between marrying your one true love and being married off to the wicked duke.
Right.
Which, if you are a princex, might happen to you.
Yes. So, and I mean, at some degree, the book is somewhat unclear about... It's clear that this would be a melding that would not be on Kven's own terms, and that, this would be a real loss of self. It isn't entirely clear that this is purely overwriting. I get the impression that each new meld does contribute some personality things.
It's more like the brain chip thing in the Texcalon books.
Right, it's just to which and
or like a Zinendor. And
what is it with everybody in melding? Stop melding, everybody.
Well, this is, I think, a time when we are really interested in identity. and selfhood.
And the mortifying ideal.
And the mortifying ordeal of being known.
Right.
But, both that, but also probably because, again, the internet, this is a time when identity gets to be more fluid. You have more of a chance to try out fluid identities. You could, try out different names and genders and stuff online in a way that, that really started by and large when we were teenagers. I don't think many people who were teenagers before us had that opportunity.
Yeah. Although maybe slightly younger than us for the full effect of it, but yeah.
And to tangent on that, I feel like that's part of where we get Veet's parents being really supportive, is that it's like that meme where you come home and you're like, this is my boyfriend and this is my boyfriend's boyfriend or whatever, and the parents are like, oh, how nice. And like, you really get the sense that when Veet is like, Mom, Nana,
and other mom,
I need you to meet Gwen, and like trying to explain them what that relationship is going to be, and they're just like, okay, we don't quite understand this Presker thing, but we're just gonna treat you like a daughter-in-law immediately.
Daughter-in-law?
And, like, welcome you in, like, great, we've got tons of foster kids, we're happy to take you in as well, we support you, you can just call me Mom, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that I know that you, having read Gwen as Kevin, but...
No. I mean, he is more female-coded in the...
Including very specifically when he is sexually assaulted, the entire narrative becomes, well, it was your fault for putting yourself in that position.
Yes. No, you're absolutely right about that. And I just want to briefly mention that I do want to give the book credit for not making sort of the roots of sexual or merging, revulsion. It makes it more sort of complicated than that, which makes it more interesting. But I think that I do agree that, like, the supportive parent thing it's both very funny how they immediately swing into doing the right thing.
Right. Even when, like, they've barely gotten to talk to Reet. They haven't met Gwen, but they're like, wait, so this person is supposed to have some sort of sexual maturation, adulthood merging thing with our Reet. So clearly this is just, this is the nice young person that they would be bringing home for dinner if everyone weren't already behind bars for being a danger to mankind.
It's also, like, incredibly important for that to work that Reed is 30 and not 16. Because, like, imagine the situation if these were parents of a human teenager.
Right, but it's different when it's your somewhat shiftless 30-year-old son who spent his entire adulthood sort of working dead-end jobs and then suddenly gets kind of worryingly into a possible ethnic background.
Yes.
Where they're trying to be supportive of this, but they're also like, these people seem a little bit sketchy to us. And then, now it's a completely different problem, but they're dealing with this completely different problem by just doubling down on being as normal about it as they can be and being like, oh, but you found someone.
Yeah, that basically taglines into what I had forgotten that I was going to say, which is it also had, like, oh my god, we thought you were never going to settle down energy.
Right, exactly.
Like, it's the old maid gender swappy thing of, like, a shiftless bachelor son has found somebody who understands him.
Yes, he found somebody equally sticky and desirous of human flesh. But I really liked the parents. I thought the parents were great characters.
Yes, and I really liked that one of the three parents is kind of terrible, but is still trying. Like, I can't remember if it's AM. I don't remember the pronouns for Nana.
Yeah.
But, we're like, Nana will make an effort to apologize later for being an asshole. And everyone else kind of makes excuses for Nana. And the book points this out. The book points out that actually maybe you shouldn't just be making excuses for somebody who's being terrible. Maybe you should make them be less terrible. But still, these three parents are so much better than any other parents we see.
Yes, I agree.
I also think it's interesting that they belong to this completely other marginalized ethnic group, because one of the things we really haven't talked about at all is what's going on with the Hipiki.
Yes.
That Reet is getting involved in the Hipiki, which have an ongoing thing.
I think it's Hikipi, actually.
Hikipi.
Sorry.
Well, their whole thing. Meanwhile, Reet's family belongs to a completely different ethnic minority, which absolutely everybody, like, there's a moment when Reet is looking at the Hikipi art and being like, oh yeah, the demon in this art is extremely my parents' religion coded.
Right.
That's
really
uncomfortable. And that, like, Reet has been trained. When Reet gets into custody, Reet, like, knows I'm not going to say a word without my lawyer, even though this particular case is completely different than what his parents have given him the training for. But it's it's the talk of, you may be targeted by the authorities because of your particular ethnic background, so here's your rule book for it. And I just thought that was a really interesting extra bit for the kinds of parents that they are, and how that prepares Reet for dealing with the wider political landscape that he really did not intend to end up in.
Yes. So that unfortunately sort of brings me back to talking about the ending again. There's a circle that's a spiral at the ending of this tale, where our heroes talk their issues out while in narrative jail. The metaphor's the usual incremental progress, but sadly for the pacing, it's just kind of a mess. Which is, I think that it's all dealt with I think a really nice sort of level of, of realism and sort of multicultural awareness, where it's like, okay, yeah, this is the sort of the ethnic pride group who are, getting kind of culty with you, but it is in fact just a bunch of people getting together to to drink coffee and sing old songs. But then at the end, it turns out that they are in fact funding the terrorists. And also, like, the major character from that group that we see, that Reet met first, Mr. Nut Carl, he vanishes. Like we meet, like, and it's so sort of jarring because we meet like almost every other character who was in the conference room in the sort of interminable loop walking segment, but we don't meet Mr. Nut Carl, and then he's just gone and never mentioned again.
Blew himself up.
Oh, I assumed that.
No, he was in the conference room while this happened.
I assumed that, like, he immediately got arrested and was in custody, refusing to answer questions and yelling about how the Presco don't really exist.
Yeah, but we don't know that because we don't see him.
Yeah, he just gets completely dropped.
He just completely vanishes, and it's like we actually that was actually kind of a thread and a character, and it's sort of, things have gotten very simple here at the end, in a way that doesn't sit particularly well with the rest of the narrative up to this point.
Yeah, I mean, I did like that the Hikipi are genuinely oppressed, but also genuinely funding terrorism, and also they're being oppressed for their, among other things, religious beliefs, and that's bad, but some of their religious beliefs are really dumb conspiracy theories, and that's also not great.
Yeah, I mean, again, to the author of the audiobook, it didn't help that you gave him an African sort of accent. And,
yeah, that's not great.
I want to say Nigerian, but you know how these things are. whereas they gave Reed's parents a Caribbean accent for their different ethnic group. But yeah, no, I was just sort of the abruptness of the way that was sort of like, yep, they were the bad guys all along, and we're moving on. But yeah, you were right in that it does go out of its way to point out that their grievances are legitimate, and that, you know, Reed also really feels like their grievances are legitimate, and it's definitely ultimately the Radshai who are the bad guys here.
Well, I think it's that there's a lot of, I'm not going to say it's ultimately
There's
the
a lot of
Radshai.
bad guys.
There's a lot of bad guys. There's, you know, the Presker translators are being bad guys towards Kven, and the society that Reed grew up in are, you know, somewhat the bad guys in that they're oppressing Reed's ethnicity and also kind of marginalizing the Hikipi. And then there's the people who are committing genocide against the Hikipi in like one system over or whatever. But you know, also the Hikipi are like, lots of people are being bad. These people are exactly the bad guys because it's been generations and generations of violence. That's part of the point. You can't just point and say these are the bad guys. Even the Radsh in this case, the Radshai characters are obnoxious, most of them, except for Ambassador Tiban Vori, who is also obnoxious, but I love her nonetheless.
She's deliberately obnoxious
to the other Radshai
in a politically hilarious way,
in the hopes that this will get her fired so that she can go home.
Yes, no, that is very good.
But you know, the thing is that the Radshai are actually relatively well behaved in this one. You know, I mean, they're not being great. They're supporting the Presker translators, but
our what is her name?
Ambassador Siamat or whatever is the one who brings in the Hikipi extremists. But, like, still, it's not actually clear, like, you know, everything, there is nuance in all of the things. When we first hear about the Hikipi conflict, it's when Anna, who we have barely touched on, is like exploring the universe for the first time and is completely baffled by this political protest that, to our eyes, immediately, at least to my eyes, immediately read as a die-in protest, when there's just like all of these people lying on the ground and like some toys there, and it's only later that C realizes that they were symbolizing the people who were killed by police officers at a supposedly peaceful protest rally.
Right. So I do want to speak up on behalf of the Radshai here, because I think that, again, we know that the Radshai Empire has committed tons of atrocities, and the ambassador is making bad decisions, but I think that the ambassador does genuinely believe that she's doing what is necessary to preserve peace. And, you know, she comes off as the bad guy partly because she's making bad decisions and partly because she's, you know, being mean to our named characters on screen and trying to take away their human rights. But from her perspective, she's trying to stop you know, she's interacted with Presker translators. A big part of her job is working with Presker translators. And so she knows that these are not necessarily people you want to just, the ones that she's met, that you want to just unleash on an unsuspecting population.
Well, yes, but her actions go more toward threatening the treaty than anything that Reed and Kven could possibly have done. Like whether she's making bad decisions or not. I mean, her motivations are pretty much completely irrelevant at that point. IMO. Sadly, in war crimes as much as in murder, good intent only brings you down to manslaughter. And there's also this thing going on with her character, which sort of is a like, it's a thing. It sort of rhymes with a thing that I see a lot in a certain kind of political discourse, where it's like, well, yes, the terrorists carried out this terrorist attack, but the people in power either knew about it and didn't do anything about it, or they, they kind of enabled it and then it got out of their hands because they were like, trying to set somebody up for a sting, or they, they needed a justification to do something else, or, which has been a sort of a calumny going back as far as the attack on Pearl Harbor, and, I don't think that's generally how things actually operate, and it didn't sit particularly well with me here.
See, I read the ambassadors bring the Hikipi guy on board, not actually understanding that this person was going to go around stabbing people or whatever, thinking that this would just wreck the trial. So, and again, I don't think this person's a good person. It's just, I just think that saying, oh, the Radshai were the bad guys all along is way oversimplifying.
I do like that our main character's happy ending is that they get to go hang out with Breck in the Republic of Two Systems.
Which still never got a better name after all.
Yeah. And it's like, we would, we want to hang out with Breck.
Yeah.
Where's Breck? Yeah. So you mentioned that we don't talk about Anna.
Yeah,
we haven't talked about Anna very much.
I think Anna's story is in many ways the simplest and happiest. This is somebody who grew up in this incredibly stifling, emotionally abusive place, and then is gently kicked out, but given a lavish allowance and told basically you can just have fun touring the galaxy, and gets to experience things like buying a cool scarf. And
honestly, the cool scarf is one of my favorite emotional beats in the whole book, is just that moment when she's like, wait, I don't need to worry about what judgmental thing my grandmother would say anymore, and I have this money. If I want this beautiful blue-green scarf, I can just buy it.
And then later someone's like, what a nice scarf!
And she also buys a fancy comb C buys a fancy comb that does show up in the ridiculous, it's like Chekhov's comb that shows up in the ridiculous final scene to like help C break through the floor to get to the other side of the loop so they can all get back to real world.
Yeah, I think I would kind of like if I would if I were rewriting this book in my head, I would have liked the ending to dispense with the whole. I would say dispense with the whole like spaceship invasion thing, but that would get rid of the dismembering the terrorist joke, which is among my favorite jokes in the book. But I would have liked less of that and more of Anna going back home and like what is having I mean, this is the hero's journey, right? Having gone forth into the world and changed it, C. I got it. It's yes. It's not German, it's C. Goes back to the old domain, the old mansion, and maybe is surprised by what C finds there, and maybe the people there are surprised by what C brings there. I would have liked that. I think that would have been fun.
Yes,
I agree.
And I felt like the thing with the cousin, that was a little bit of a letdown. I mean, it was happy. Oh, good, your new cousin still thinks you're really cool, but I felt like that just. It seemed like it was going somewhere of, oh, you thought you'd bonded with this person and you're beating yourself up for now thinking that they're not actually friends with you because they're not responding. And then, oh, suddenly, nope, that was all just you were wrong and the texts weren't getting through. It felt a little shallow.
Yeah, I would have liked a little bit more of her character arc.
Yeah. So I am also, I mean, I'm glad that it was nice to see the Gek show up again. The biomechs as ancillaries seems like a great solution, except that it does rob me of the mental image of Sphene desperate for ancillaries, raising, baby ancillaries on its on deck the way that Anandra Mianai does.
This is a cop out. I'm sorry. I dislike the mech ancillaries. I think that there should be like tube farmed humans or some other weird nonsense going on there.
And that
I
was
think it's more interesting.
But there is the great joke of, people have applied to become ancillaries and they keep getting turned down because it turns out that the sort of person who's willing to be an ancillary is too weird even for Sphene, who's desperate for more ancillaries.
It's a real good joke.
Yeah, bringing to mind the people, speaking of cannibalism, the people who are, trying to find people to eat them.
Right.
One of the themes that we get throughout is, like, being one person in multiple bodies. And part of what I really enjoyed about this book is the Presker translator version of that, because obviously in the ancillary books we have the ancillaries, though many bodies,
one person.
And in Provenance we had where they are different people, but they are legally and politically one entity when you have been given their names. So, like, there's a whole bit in the big violent showdown at the end of Provenance where the old man is like, yeah, so what? If they kill me, like, I still exist out there. My daughter is me.
Yeah, is legally
me and can do whatever I need. So, like, I'm gonna be suicidally stupid here because that's fine. And
there's a thing where Ingray is offered the chance to basically become, to be subsumed into this legal identity, even though it's not a, like, sense of self-identity. And she rejects it. And this sort of has the opposite thing of Gwen and Reet actually decide that they'll take, that they will take the chance of being subsumed into each other.
Rather than try to subsume into a biomech weirdly that, like, they might still be themselves but with a second body, but, like, it's not at all clear how that'll work. But it does seem that, like, the biomechs don't have an identity separate, so, like, it would be more of a continuation of self. And I just think it's a fascinating theme throughout.
One of the things that I did like about the ending sequence was that they keep teasing all sorts of ways in which the Gwen-Reet merge could be problematic or averted entirely before, like, letting them actually choose to do it, having had a sort of tearful, we have not recognized each other's feelings, classic sort of, again, comedy of manners, reconciliation at the end.
I thought you didn't want this. Oh.
Exactly.
What? But if you do, I was just being. It was great.
Yeah. I'm glad that we didn't have them sort of merge as a matter of necessity there on the floor of the enemy ship.
Yes.
I was also very pleased to see the Gek ambassador back.
Yes.
Because she was my favorite character from Provenance.
Yes, and it was great to see her having learned her lessons from Provenance, and thus, being very much herself, being like, no, I have learned how families work, and I have learned how to, be a better parent to, children, so let me give you some advice from my mistakes.
Yes.
It's a great bit that, like, if you haven't read Provenance, it's still fine, but having read it, it's just so great. And we get to see another Gek, because there's the Gek ambassador, but there's also the Gek council member.
Right.
And that's real fun to see what's the Gek ambassador and what is
Gek.
What is Gek. And we meet the Ra for the first time.
That's true, finally. We've heard all about them.
I'm still hoping for, presumably they'll get their own book in the fullness of time. But, there are furry overtones to the Presker translators. Don't ask me to explain that. But,
No, I would like you to explain that.
They're part human and part, like, animal, instinctual, like, sort of joyful, amoral creatures, which is kind of a furry thing.
Are you calling furries amoral, Isaac?
In perhaps its most pure expression. Don't make me go off on a disquisition about
I
what furries
apologize.
represent. But regardless, no, it would be nice to have the equivalent of the Chanur books be the
Yes.
Being weird and furry.
Yes.
So
Though, what I honestly, as much as I enjoyed this book, I really hope that Anne goes back to writing, write some more books in her weird multiple gods universe, because I really enjoyed those books and novellas and short stories and whatever.
I haven't read any.
You haven't read The Raven Tower?
No.
Oh.
Well, you should read The
You
Raven
should
Tower.
read The Raven
It's
Tower.
real good. It has, among other things, a surprisingly charming sentient swarm of mosquitoes.
It's Hamlet,
And a
but
rock.
told from the perspective of a rock god thing.
Fair enough. On the list it goes. Well, regardless.
All right. Well,
I think that we've exhausted this at this point.
Yes.
Unless there are any final notes that anybody wants to make.
no, I'm good.
Yeah, I think we covered my main things.
Cool. Well, thank you for joining us again, Leora. I really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure.
And we will see you next time for whenever I insert this. Probably, actually, just you know what? I'm gonna put this out right before we embark on our Nordic trilogy.
Okay.
So be with us next time for 4 episodes, because it's the 3 main ones and 1 bonus about books derived from Norse mythology. Enjoy those.
Yes, which you do reference. So I guess this podcast is going to contain a spoiler for our episode on Valhalla, but that's fine.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
fine.
that's true.
You know what?
It's
It
a
is
spoiler,
fine.
really, to say that book contains a lot of blood.
No, I just meant it was a spoiler for the podcast.
Oh, yes, that's
But
true.
that's fine, 'cause we're
true.
spoiler positive
The list of
podcast.
upcoming episodes is already up on... Okay, we need to end this
Yes.
now.
All right.
All
Thank
right.
you, everybody, for putting up with us. And
Bye-bye.
bye.
Bye.